The funeral had been over for 2 hours and 14 minutes. I knew this because I had been counting, watching the minutes tick by on the old clock tower that rose above the cemetery gates, its iron hands moving with a slowness that felt almost cruel. The chairs had been folded and taken away by the funeral home staff, men in dark suits who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who did this every day, who had learned to be invisible in the presence of grief. The flowers were still there, massive arrangements of white lilies and pale roses and delicate baby's breath that had cost more than I wanted to think about, their petals already beginning to brown at the edges in the afternoon heat. The tent that had sheltered the mourners during the service was being dismantled piece by piece, the metal poles clanking dully as they were taken apart, the white canvas flapping in the breeze like a surrender flag. The workers moved quietly, respectfully, pretending I wasn't there, pretending they couldn't see the widow standing motionless at the edge of her husband's grave, unable to tear herself away. Everyone else had gone. They had drifted away in small groups, their black clothes and somber faces slowly disappearing into the parking lot, their cars pulling out one by one and heading back to my mother's house for the reception. There would be food there, casseroles and cold cuts, and the kind of desserts that well-meaning neighbors always brought to funerals, as if sugar could somehow fill the hole that death had carved into my chest. There would be conversation, the low murmur of voices sharing memories of James, the awkward silences when no one knew what to say, the inevitable questions about how I was holding up, how I was managing, whether there was anything they could do. I couldn't face any of it. I couldn't sit in a room full of people who wanted to comfort me when the only comfort I wanted was lying 6 feet beneath the earth in a polished oak coffin with brass handles that had caught the sunlight during the lowering ceremony. I couldn't make small talk about the weather or the flower arrangements or the lovely eulogy that James's brother had delivered, his voice cracking on every other word. I couldn't pretend that I was okay when I wasn't sure I would ever be okay again. My husband James had been dead for 5 days, 120 hours, 7,200 minutes, an eternity compressed into less than a week. The official cause of death was a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, his silver sedan hydroplaning across the median and into oncoming traffic, where it had collided with a semi-truck carrying a load of lumber. The police report was clinical and detached, filled with words like excessive speed for conditions and loss of vehicle control and blunt force trauma. The toxicology report had come back completely clean, no alcohol, no drugs, no substances of any kind in his system. Just a man in a hurry on a stormy night, driving too fast on a road that had turned treacherous with rain and wind. A tragic accident, a senseless loss, a life cut short at 34 years old. Case closed. But I knew James. I knew him better than any police report could ever know him, better than the officers who had investigated the crash, better than the coroner who had performed the autopsy, better than anyone else in the entire world. I had shared his bed for 7 years. I had learned every detail of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was genuinely laughing, the slight crookedness of his front tooth that he was self-conscious about, but that I found completely endearing. I knew his habits, his routines, his peculiarities. He was the most careful driver I had ever met, a man who checked his mirrors twice before changing lanes and never exceeded the speed limit by more than 5 miles per hour, a man who insisted on having the car serviced every 3,000 miles exactly and kept a logbook of every oil change and tire rotation. He would never have been speeding on a wet road at night. It went against everything that defined him. He would never have been on that particular stretch of highway at all. It was 40 miles from his office, 30 miles from our home, a remote stretch of interstate that led nowhere he had any reason to go. When I had pointed this out to the police, they had nodded sympathetically and made notes in their little black notebooks, but I could tell they weren't really listening. To them, I was just a grieving widow grasping at straws, looking for meaning in a meaningless tragedy. They had seen it 100 times before, and they had learned to smile and nod, and then go back to their desks and close the case. But none of that mattered now. The case was officially closed, the death certificate signed and filed, the insurance claim already being processed by a board adjuster in a cubicle somewhere who had never met James and never would. My husband was dead, and the world expected me to accept it and move on. To grieve, yes, but to grieve appropriately, to grieve on a schedule, to grieve in a way that made other people comfortable, to eventually pack away his clothes and his books and the thousand small reminders of his existence that filled every corner of our house, to eventually stop reaching for him in the middle of the night, my hands searching for his warmth on the empty side of the bed, to eventually, in some distant future I couldn't yet imagine, be okay again. I couldn't move on. I couldn't even move. I stood at the edge of his grave, my heels sinking slightly into the soft, freshly turned earth, and I stared at the mound of soil that had been piled beside the rectangular hole, waiting to be shoveled back in by the cemetery workers who were giving me space to say my final goodbyes. The coffin was down there, beneath the arrangement of white roses that had been placed on top of the lowering device, and James was inside it, wearing the blue suit I had picked out for him, the one he had worn to our wedding rehearsal dinner, the one that brought out the color of his eyes. I had stood in the funeral home for almost an hour, staring at the rack of his clothes, trying to decide what he would want to be buried in. It was a decision I had never imagined making, a choice so mundane and so devastating that it had nearly broken me. In the end, I had chosen the blue suit, and I had added his favorite tie, the navy silk one with the tiny silver dots, and I had tucked a photograph of the two of us on our honeymoon into the pocket of his jacket, a small piece of our life together to accompany him into whatever came next. I felt nothing. That was the strangest part. Not grief, not anger, not even numbness. Just a vast, empty silence where my emotions used to live, as if someone had reached into my chest and scooped out everything that made me human. The black dress I was wearing felt like a costume, the sort of thing an actress would wear in a movie about a widow, a prop to signal to the audience that this character was in mourning. The black veil over my face, a concession to tradition that my mother had insisted upon, felt like a barrier between me and the world, a piece of gauze that separated the living from the dead. I had not cried since the night the police came to my door, their faces carefully composed into expressions of professional sympathy. I had not cried at the hospital, where they had taken me to identify his body, where I had stood in a cold, sterile room and looked down at my husband's face, which was peaceful and still and so completely, utterly absent of the life that had animated it for 34 years. I had not cried at the funeral home, where I had picked out the coffin and the flowers and the music and the program and all the other details that no one ever thinks about until they are forced to. I had not cried during the service, when his mother had sobbed so loudly and so uncontrollably that they had to pause the eulogy, when his father had stood at the podium with tears streaming down his face and tried to describe what it felt like to bury a child. I was all cried out, drained completely dry, empty as a desert, hollow as a shell. The cemetery was quiet now, the kind of deep, resonant quiet that only exists in places where the dead outnumber the living. The last of the funeral home workers had finished packing up the tent and driven away in a white van that had kicked up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the gravel road. The birds were singing in the ancient oak trees that lined the perimeter of the grounds, a cheerful chorus of chirps and trills that seemed almost offensive given the circumstances. The sun was warm on my shoulders, a gentle, golden warmth that felt out of place in a cemetery, and a soft breeze stirred the petals of the funeral flowers, carrying the faint, sweet scent of lilies across the grass. It was a beautiful day, the kind of perfect late summer day that James had always loved, the kind of day that would have prompted him to suggest a picnic or a hike or a drive through the countryside with the windows down and the radio playing. And I hated it. I hated the sun and the birds and the breeze and the flowers. I hated the beauty of the world that had continued to turn without him in it. I hated that everything could look so lovely when my life had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I heard footsteps behind me, soft and tentative on the grass, the sound of small feet making their way across the cemetery lawn. I didn't turn around. I didn't have the energy for another conversation with a well-meaning relative or a sympathetic friend. I assumed it was my mother, who had been hovering around me all day like a nervous guardian angel, adjusting my veil and smoothing my dress, and asking me every 10 minutes if I needed water or food or a place to sit down. Or perhaps it was my sister, who had flown in from the West Coast and had been crying almost as much as James's mother, her grief a mirror of my own, her pain a reminder of everything I was trying not to feel. I didn't want to talk to either of them. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I wanted to stand here, alone, until the cemetery closed and someone forced me to leave. Mrs. Callahan? The voice was small, high-pitched, unmistakably young. A child's voice, clear and bright, cutting through the heavy silence like a bell. That was strange enough to make me turn around. The girl standing behind me was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, though I had never been good at guessing children's ages. She was small for her size, with dark brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail that was tied with a simple black ribbon. Her face was heart-shaped and serious, with large brown eyes that seemed too old, too knowing, too wise for her young features. There was a gravity in her expression that was unusual for a child, a stillness that made her seem almost otherworldly. She was wearing a simple black dress, the kind a child would wear to a funeral or a piano recital, with a white collar and black patent leather shoes that were scuffed at the toes. In her hands, she was holding something, a small object wrapped carefully in a white handkerchief, the kind of handkerchief that James used to carry in his pocket, the kind with his initials embroidered in the corner. I recognized it immediately, and my heart gave a strange, lurching thump in my chest. "I'm sorry for your loss," the girl said, the words coming out carefully, deliberately, as if she had rehearsed them many times before approaching me. Her voice was soft but clear, and there was something in her tone that was almost formal, almost adult. Mr. Callahan was a very kind man. He had a gentle soul. He didn't deserve what happened to him. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing and hearing. She was a stranger, a child I had never seen before in my life, and yet she was speaking about my husband with a familiarity that was deeply unsettling. "Thank you," I said automatically, the words that had become a reflex over the past 5 days, a programmed response to every expression of sympathy. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Are you a friend of the family? Did you come with your parents?" The girl shook her head slowly, her dark ponytail swaying with the movement. "No, I never met him. Not really. Not when he was alive." She paused, and something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been uncertainty or might have been fear. "But I have something for you. Something very important. He asked me to give it to you. He said it was the only way you would know the truth." A chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the afternoon sun, a cold, creeping sensation that started at the base of my skull and traveled all the way down to my fingertips. "What do you mean, he asked you to give it to me?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "James asked you. When? How is that possible?" The girl didn't flinch at the intensity of my questions. She just looked at me with those serious, knowing eyes, her expression perfectly calm. "He came to me in a dream," she said, as if that were the most normal thing in the world, as if she were explaining that the sky was blue or that water was wet. 2 nights ago, I was sleeping, and suddenly I wasn't in my room anymore. I was standing in a field, a big field with tall grass and wildflowers, and there was a man there. He was tall, and he had kind eyes, and he was wearing a blue suit. A blue suit with a silver tie that had little dots on it. My heart stopped. The blue suit. The silver tie with the little dots. Those were details that no one could have known, details that I had chosen myself, alone, in the funeral home. The burial had been closed casket because of the damage from the accident. No one had seen James in that suit except for me and the funeral director. There was no way this child, this stranger, could have known what he was wearing unless she was telling the truth. "He told me his name was James Callahan," the girl continued, her voice steady and calm. "He said he had died in a car accident, but it wasn't really an accident. He said there were bad men who had been chasing him, and they caused the crash. He said the police think he did something terrible, something he didn't do, and he needed your help to prove he was innocent. He told me where to find this." She held out her hands. offering me the white handkerchief-wrapped bundle. He said he hid it before the accident, in a place only he knew about. He described it to me in the dream. A hollow tree in the woods behind an old church. He said I would find it there, and I did. I went there yesterday with my mother, and I found it exactly where he said it would be. I reached out and took the bundle from her with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. The handkerchief was soft and worn, the cotton thin from years of use, and the initials J.A.C., James Alexander Callahan, were embroidered in the corner in faded navy thread. I recognized it. It was one of the set I had given him for our 3rd anniversary, the set his grandmother had embroidered for him when he graduated from college. He had carried one in his pocket every single day, a little piece of home that went everywhere with him. Seeing it here, in the hands of a strange child, in the middle of a cemetery, on the day of his funeral, felt like a message from another world. He also said to tell you something, the girl said, and for the first time, her voice faltered slightly, as if the weight of the words she was carrying was almost too much for her young shoulders. He said to tell you that he's sorry. Sorry for not telling you the truth while he was alive. Sorry for keeping secrets from you. He said he wanted to tell you everything, but he was scared. Scared of what you would think of him. Scared that you would leave him if you knew the whole story. And then he ran out of time. Tears were streaming down my face now. Tears I hadn't been able to shed all week. Tears that had been locked away behind the wall of numbness I had built around myself. They came in a flood, hot and unstoppable, blurring my vision and making it hard to breathe. What didn't he do? I whispered, my voice breaking on every word. What was he accused of? I don't know, the girl admitted, and a flicker of frustration crossed her face, as if she were disappointed in herself for not having all the answers. He just told me to say that. He made me repeat it 3 times in the dream, so I would remember it perfectly. He said, tell her I didn't do it. Tell her I'm not guilty. Tell her the truth is in the journal. He was very insistent about that. He said his whole life, everything he had ever done, everything people would say about him, it all came down to this. And he needed you to know that he was innocent. I looked down at the bundle in my hands, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the white handkerchief. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind that James used to carry with him everywhere, the kind he used to record his thoughts and ideas and observations about the world. He had dozens of them, stacked neatly on the shelves of his home office, a lifetime of thoughts preserved in his cramped, precise handwriting. But this journal was different from the others. This one was worn and weathered, its leather cover scuffed and stained, its pages warped as if they had been exposed to moisture. It looked like it had been through something terrible, like it had survived a storm or a flood or a long journey through the wilderness. It looked like it had a story to tell. Tucked into the front cover, held in place by a frayed rubber band, was a photograph. I pulled it free with trembling fingers and stared at the image printed on the glossy paper. It was a photograph of a woman I had never seen before, a woman who was young and beautiful, probably in her late 20s, with dark, wavy hair that fell past her shoulders and striking green eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the faded print. She was smiling at the camera with an expression of pure, unguarded happiness, the kind of smile that came from genuine joy, not from posing. She was sitting at a table in what looked like a coffee shop, a cup of something warm cradled in her hands, and behind her, a window looked out onto a city street. There was something intimate about the photograph, something that suggested a close relationship between the photographer and the subject. And I knew, with a sick, twisting certainty in the pit of my stomach, that the photographer had been my husband. Who is this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Did he tell you who this woman is? The girl nodded slowly. He said her name is Rebecca. Rebecca Vance. He said she was murdered. He said the police think he killed her, but he didn't. He said the real killer is still out there, walking free, and the proof is in the journal. The names, the dates, the evidence, everything you need to prove he was innocent. It's all in there. She paused, her brown eyes meeting mine with an intensity that was almost unsettling. He also said to tell you that he loves you. That was the very last thing he said to me before the dream ended. He said, tell my wife that I love her more than anything in this world. Tell her that she was the best thing that ever happened to me. Tell her that I'm sorry I never told her about Rebecca. I was going to tell her everything, but I ran out of time. And then he smiled, and the field faded away, and I woke up in my own bed. I opened my mouth to ask another question, to demand more information, to somehow make sense of the impossible, inexplicable, miraculous things this child was telling me. But before I could speak, a woman's voice called out from the edge of the cemetery, high and anxious, the voice of a mother looking for her child. Sophie, Sophie, where are you? It's time to go home. We're going to be late for your grandmother's. The girl glanced over her shoulder, her expression flickering with something that looked almost like regret. That's my mom, she said. I have to go. She doesn't know about the dream. She wouldn't understand. She doesn't believe in things like that. She turned and started to walk away across the grass, her small black shoes leaving faint impressions in the soft earth. But after a few steps, she paused and looked back at me over her shoulder. He really did love you, Mrs. Callahan. I could feel it. Even in the dream, I could feel how much he loved you. It was like warmth, like standing in front of a fire on a cold day. And he wanted me to make sure you knew that. That was the most important part of the whole message. And then she was gone, running across the grass toward a woman standing beside a blue minivan parked at the cemetery entrance, her ponytail bouncing behind her, her black dress fluttering in the breeze. I watched her go, my mind reeling, my heart pounding, the journal heavy in my hands. A dream. A child's dream. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the kind of thing that happened in ghost stories and fairy tales and movies on the Hallmark Channel, not in real life. And yet, the journal was real. The photograph was real. The handkerchief, with my husband's initials embroidered in the corner, was real. The words the girl had spoken, words that meant nothing to her, but everything to me, were real. James had been accused of murder. A woman named Rebecca Vance. He had hidden evidence in a hollow tree behind an old church. He had sent a child, a messenger from the other side of existence, to deliver his final confession and his final plea for justice. None of it made any rational sense. And yet all of it felt true in a way that went beyond logic, beyond evidence, beyond the cold, hard facts that I had always relied on to make sense of the world. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in dreams that could cross the boundary between the living and the dead. I didn't believe in messages from beyond the grave. But I believed in James. And I believed that he had loved me. And I believed that if there was any way, any possible way, for him to reach me one last time, he would have found it. I sat down on the grass beside my husband's grave, my legs no longer able to support me, and I held the journal in my hands, feeling its weight, its texture, its reality. The photograph of the green-eyed woman stared up at me, her smile frozen in time, her life cut short by violence. Rebecca Vance, murdered, and my husband, accused of the crime. It was a secret so enormous, so life-altering, that I couldn't fully comprehend it. The man I had loved for 7 years, the man I had married and lived with and built a life with, had been carrying a burden I knew nothing about. He had been accused of a terrible crime, and he had never told me. He had kept it hidden, buried, a shadow in the corner of our life together that I had never noticed because I had never thought to look. The sun moved across the sky as I sat there, the shadows of the oak trees lengthening and stretching across the grass like dark fingers. The birds continued their singing, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath them. The flowers on the grave continued their slow wilting, their petals dropping one by one onto the freshly turned earth. And I continued to sit, frozen in place, suspended between the life I had known and whatever new. Terrifying reality was waiting for me inside the pages of that journal. James had a secret so dark and so dangerous that it had cost him his life. And now, from beyond the grave, from whatever place souls go when their bodies are broken and buried, he was asking me to uncover it. The cemetery was growing dark by the time I finally found the courage to open the journal. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and burnt orange, and the first stars were just beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light in the vast darkness of the evening sky. The automatic lights along the cemetery paths had flickered on, casting pools of pale yellow onto the manicured grass. I knew I should leave. I knew my family would be worried, that my mother would be calling my phone, that my sister would be pacing the floor of my childhood home, wondering where I was and why I hadn't come back. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth. I opened the journal. The first page was dated almost exactly 3 years earlier, and the handwriting was unmistakably James's. Neat, precise, each letter formed with the careful attention to detail that had made him such a brilliant engineer, the kind of man who could design a bridge or a skyscraper and know that every calculation was correct to the decimal point. But the words themselves were anything but precise. They were rushed, frantic, the writing of a man who was deeply, desperately afraid for his life. If you are reading this, the entry began, then I am probably dead. I have kept this journal hidden because I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know who to turn to. I didn't know how to explain what was happening without putting everyone I loved in danger. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and the clarity that comes from facing my own mortality, I realize that I should have trusted you, Elena. I should have told you everything from the very beginning. You were my wife. You were my partner. You deserved to know the truth, the whole truth, no matter how ugly or frightening it was. But I was scared. Scared of what you would think of me if you knew the things I had done, the mistakes I had made, the people I had become entangled with. Scared that you would look at me differently, that you would see a stranger instead of the man you had married. Scared that you would leave me, and that losing you would be worse than anything else that could happen to me. I see now that my fear was my undoing. My silence has cost me everything. And if you are reading this, it has probably cost you everything too. I am so sorry, Elena. More sorry than I can ever express in words. I turned the page, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the simple mechanical task. My tears were falling onto the paper, blurring the ink in places, and I had to wipe my eyes repeatedly just to make out the words. Her name was Rebecca Vance. She was an architect, a brilliant one, with a mind that could see possibilities in spaces that other people overlooked. We worked together at Morrison Engineering, the firm I was at before I started my own practice. This was before I met you, before we fell in love, before you became the center of my world. Rebecca and I had a brief relationship. It lasted only a few months, a handful of dates, a connection that felt intense at the time, but faded quickly when we both realized we wanted different things from life. We parted on good terms, or so I thought. She left the firm shortly afterward, moved to another city, and I assumed that chapter of my life was closed forever. I never expected to see her again. I never expected to hear her voice. And I certainly never expected that she would be the person who would ultimately destroy my life. The journal went on to describe, in meticulous detail, a series of events that read like something out of a crime thriller. 3 years ago, James had received a phone call from Rebecca Vance, completely out of the blue. She had been crying, her voice shaking with fear, barely coherent. She told him she was in trouble, serious trouble, the kind of trouble that could get a person killed. She said she had become involved with a man named Vincent D'Angelo, a powerful figure with connections to organized crime. She hadn't known who he really was when they first started seeing each other. He had presented himself as a legitimate businessman, a real estate developer with properties all over the city. But as their relationship deepened, she had started to see glimpses of his true nature, the violence simmering beneath the polished surface, the dangerous people who came and went from his office at all hours, the way he spoke about his enemies as if they were obstacles to be eliminated rather than people to be reasoned with. By the time she realized what she had gotten herself into, it was too late to simply walk away. D'Angelo had used her, manipulated her, made her an unwitting participant in his schemes. He had used her architectural expertise to design hiding places in his properties, secret rooms, and concealed compartments where he could store documents, money, and other things she didn't want to think about. She had become a liability to him, a loose end that needed to be tied up, and she was terrified that he was going to kill her to keep her silent. James had agreed to meet with her. It was, he wrote, one of the biggest mistakes of his life. but he had been unable to refuse. She had sounded so desperate, so alone, so convinced that she was about to die. He had told himself he was just going to listen, just going to offer advice, maybe help her find a lawyer or a safe place to stay. He had no intention of getting involved in whatever dark world she had stumbled into. But good intentions, as he wrote in the journal, had a way of crumbling when confronted with genuine desperation. They met in a coffee shop downtown, a crowded, noisy place where they could talk without being overheard. Rebecca had brought documents with her, copies of financial records and property deeds and wire transfer receipts that she had secretly made before fleeing D'Angelo's orbit. She had also brought recordings, audio files she had captured on her phone during conversations with D'Angelo and his associates, conversations in which they discussed money laundering, bribery, and worse. She gave copies of everything to James and asked him to keep them safe, to be her insurance policy. If something happened to her, she wanted someone to have the evidence that could bring D'Angelo down. 2 weeks later, the journal continued. Rebecca Vance was found dead in her apartment. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The police investigation, which I followed obsessively in the news, focused on me almost immediately. My fingerprints were in her apartment from that last meeting. My phone records showed multiple calls to her number in the weeks before her death. Witnesses at the coffee shop remembered seeing us together, remembered that she had seemed agitated, remembered that I had looked nervous. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, but it was compelling. I was terrified that I was going to be arrested for a murder I didn't commit. But there was more. James had gone to Rebecca's apartment that night, the night she died. She had called him, frantic, saying that D'Angelo had found her, that he knew about the copies she had made, that he was coming to silence her. James had driven to her apartment as fast as he could, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. The door was slightly ajar, the lights were off, and Rebecca was lying on the floor of her living room in a pool of her own blood. And he saw him, a man in a dark coat, his face partially hidden by a hat and a turned-up collar, slipping out the back door of the building. James had chased him, running down the fire escape and into the alley behind the building. But the man had disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the echo of his footsteps. I didn't call the police, James wrote, his handwriting becoming shakier, more agitated, as he recounted this part of the story. I panicked. I knew how it would look. My fingerprints were all over her apartment. My phone records showed I had been calling her. Witnesses could place us together. If I called the police and told them I had found her body, I would be the prime suspect. I would be arrested, charged, convicted. I would spend the rest of my life in prison for a crime I didn't commit. So I ran. And I have been running ever since, even though I never left home, even though I continued to go to work and live my life and pretend that everything was normal. Inside, I was running. Inside, I was hiding. Inside, I was waiting for the knock on the door that would end my life as I knew it. I closed my eyes, trying to absorb the enormity of what I had just read. My husband, the man I thought I knew better than anyone in the world, had been living a double life for our entire marriage. Not a double life of infidelity or deception, but a double life of fear and secrecy and desperate, soul-crushing isolation. He had witnessed a murder. He had hidden evidence. He had been living with the constant terror of being discovered, of being arrested, of losing everything he had built. And he had never told me. Not a single word. Not a single hint. He had carried this burden alone, day after day, year after year, and I had been completely, blissfully unaware. The final entry in the journal was dated 5 days before his death, the same day as the car accident, or perhaps the day before it. The handwriting was even shakier than before, the letters uneven and rushed, as if he had been writing in a state of extreme agitation. I think they found me. The men who killed Rebecca, the men who have been protecting Vincent D'Angelo all these years. For the past week, I've noticed a car following me. The same dark sedan, always a few cars behind, always there when I look in the rearview mirror. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, just the accumulated stress of 3 years of living with this secret. But I know it's not. They're watching me. They're waiting. They're planning something. I've been gathering more evidence, more documentation, trying to build a case that I can take to someone who will actually listen. But I'm running out of time. I can feel it. If something happens to me in the next few days, if I die under suspicious circumstances, if my car goes off the road, or I have an accident, or I simply disappear, please know that it wasn't an accident. Please know that I was murdered, just like Rebecca was murdered. And please, for the love of everything we had together, clear my name. Prove that I was innocent. Bring the real killer to justice. And then, the final lines, the words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The evidence is in the hollow tree behind the old church on Mill Road. The one with the broken steeple. You know the place. We drove past it once, on our way to the mountains, and you said it looked like something out of a fairy tale. I hid everything there, in a waterproof bag, sealed tight. Photographs, recordings, documents, everything you need to prove that I was innocent and that Vincent D'Angelo is guilty. Take it to someone you trust. Take it to the press, if you have to. But don't take it to the police. The police in this town are compromised. I don't know who is on D'Angelo's payroll and who isn't, and I can't risk the evidence falling into the wrong hands. I love you, Elena. I have loved you from the moment I first saw you, standing in the rain outside the library with a stack of books in your arms and an expression of fierce determination on your face. You were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and I knew, in that instant, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. I'm sorry that the rest of my life turned out to be so short. I'm sorry I never told you the truth. I'm sorry for everything. Please don't let them get away with this. Please make sure that Rebecca's family knows she was innocent, that she was trying to do the right thing, that she died because she was brave. And please, when this is all over, find a way to be happy again. You deserve happiness. You deserve joy. You deserve a life that isn't defined by my mistakes. All my love, forever and always, James. I sat there in the gathering darkness, the journal open in my lap, the tears streaming down my face in a continuous, unbroken flow. I wasn't just crying for James anymore. I was crying for Rebecca Vance, the woman with the green eyes and the radiant smile, a woman I had never met, but whose death had cast a shadow over my entire marriage. I was crying for the years of fear and isolation my husband had endured, carrying a burden so heavy it had eventually crushed him. And I was crying for myself, for the life I had thought I was living, for the marriage I had thought was built on honesty and trust, for the future that had been stolen from me by a man named Vincent D'Angelo and the dark, violent world he inhabited. But I was also feeling something else, something that was slowly replacing the grief and the shock and the overwhelming sadness. It was determination, a cold, hard, unshakable determination to finish what my husband had started, to clear his name, to bring Rebecca's killer to justice, to make sure that Vincent D'Angelo paid for everything he had done. James had asked me to be brave, and I would be brave. James had asked me to be strong, and I would be strong. James had asked me to find the evidence and make sure the truth came out, and I would do exactly that. I stood up, brushing the grass from my black dress, and I looked down at the mound of earth that covered my husband's coffin. "I hear you," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying all the conviction I could muster. "I hear you, James. I'll find out who did this. I'll clear your name. I'll make sure the world knows you were innocent. I promise." The drive to the old church on Mill Road took nearly an hour. It was fully dark by the time I arrived, the headlights of my car cutting through the dense blackness of the country roads. The church was exactly as I remembered it from that long-ago drive to the mountains, a crumbling stone building with a steeple that listed dangerously to one side, its roof partially collapsed, its windows boarded up with weathered plywood. It had been abandoned for decades, left to decay slowly in the middle of nowhere, a relic of a time when this part of the state had been more populated. James had pulled over that day so I could take pictures of it, and I had said it looked like something out of a fairy tale, a haunted church in a haunted forest, the kind of place where witches and goblins and dark magic might be real. Behind the church, a dense forest stretched into the darkness, the trees so thick and so ancient that their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out most of the sky. I parked my car at the edge of the gravel lot, the only vehicle for miles in any direction, and I got out, using the flashlight app on my phone to navigate the uneven ground. The forest was silent, the kind of deep, watchful silence that feels almost alive, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig beneath my feet, made my heart jump in my chest. I found the hollow tree exactly where the journal had described it. It was a massive old oak, probably centuries old, its trunk so wide that 3 people couldn't have linked arms around it. At its base, a natural hollow had formed, a dark opening just large enough to reach into. I knelt down in the damp earth, not caring about the dirt staining my funeral dress, and I pushed my hand into the darkness. My fingers brushed against something solid, something smooth and manufactured, and I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made my head spin. I pulled it out. It was a waterproof bag, the kind used for camping or boating, sealed tightly with a heavy-duty zipper. Inside, I could feel the shapes of documents, a computer drive, and a small electronic device. I didn't open the bag there, in the dark and the cold and the oppressive silence of the forest. I took it back to my car, locked the doors, and drove home as fast as I safely could. My mother's house, where the reception had been held, was dark and quiet when I finally arrived, hours after everyone else had left. I let myself in with my key, walked past the kitchen where the leftover casseroles were still sitting on the counter, past the living room where the sympathy cards were arranged on the mantelpiece like a paper graveyard, and I went up to my childhood bedroom, the room where I had slept as a girl, and I closed the door behind me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the same bed where I had dreamed of my future as a teenager, where I had imagined the man I would marry and the life we would build together, and I opened the bag. The documents were everything James had promised. Financial records, bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, all of them tracing money from shell companies controlled by Vincent D'Angelo to various criminal enterprises and, more damningly, to several members of the local police department. The USB drive contained dozens of audio files, recordings of conversations between Rebecca Vance and D'Angelo, conversations in which he threatened her, demanded her silence, and warned her of the consequences if she ever went to the authorities. And the small digital recorder, the electronic device I had felt through the bag, contained a single file. A voice memo recorded by James himself, his voice calm and steady and heartbreakingly familiar. I listened to the recording 3 times, tears streaming down my face with each repetition, my heart breaking and mending and breaking again. This was my husband's voice, speaking to me from beyond the grave, telling me the truth he had been too afraid to share while he was alive. He had been a good man caught in a terrible situation, a witness to a crime he couldn't report, a keeper of secrets he couldn't share, and it had gotten him killed. But he had left behind everything I needed to make things right, everything I needed to clear his name and bring a killer to justice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up in my childhood bed, the evidence spread out around me, and I planned my next move. The police were compromised. James had warned me about that. But there were other avenues, other people who might listen. A journalist in the city, a woman named Sarah Chun, had written extensively about organized crime and police corruption. I had read her articles in the newspaper, had admired her tenacity and her courage. I would reach out to her. I would give her everything James had gathered, and I would let her tell the story that would clear my husband's name and bring Vincent D'Angelo to justice. The next morning, I sent her an email, attaching the most important documents and audio files. I explained who I was, what I had discovered, and why it mattered. I didn't know if she would believe me. I didn't know if she would respond. But it was the only thing I could think to do, the only path forward that made any sense. Her response came within the hour. "Mrs. Callahan," she wrote, "I have been investigating Vincent D'Angelo for 2 years. I have never been able to get enough solid evidence to publish. What you've sent me is extraordinary. This could be the break I've been waiting for. Can you meet me today?" We met at a coffee shop in the city, a small, quiet place with brick walls and mismatched furniture and the smell of freshly ground beans in the air. Sarah Chun was a slight woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a presence that commanded attention despite her small stature. She listened to my story without interrupting, her expression focused and intense. And when I finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Your husband was a brave man," she said quietly, her voice full of a respect that felt genuine and deeply felt. "He was trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation, and it cost him his life. But the evidence he gathered, the evidence you've brought me, it's more than enough. It's everything. With this, I can write the story that will bring down Vincent D'Angelo and expose the corruption that protected him for so many years. Your husband's name will be cleared. Rebecca Vance will finally get justice. I promise you that." The story broke 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, splashed across the front page of the city's largest newspaper. It was the kind of explosive investigative piece that dominated the headlines for days, that was picked up by national news outlets, that sparked conversations and debates and demands for reform. Vincent D'Angelo was arrested at his waterfront mansion, his face a mask of shock and fury as he was led away in handcuffs. Several members of his criminal organization were rounded up in coordinated raids. And 2 police officers, men who had been on D'Angelo's payroll for years, were taken into custody, their badges stripped, their careers destroyed. The evidence James had gathered, the documents and recordings and photographs he had hidden in a hollow tree behind an abandoned church, was described by prosecutors as the foundation of the entire case. Without it, they said, D'Angelo might have continued to evade justice indefinitely. Without it, Rebecca Vance's murder might never have been solved. Without it, an innocent man's name might have been forever tarnished by suspicion and accusation. James was exonerated, his name cleared of any involvement in Rebecca's death. The news coverage described him not as a suspect, but as a hero, a man who had tried to do the right thing and had paid the ultimate price. I read those articles in my kitchen, the same kitchen where James and I had eaten breakfast together every morning for 7 years, and I felt a sense of peace settling over me like a warm blanket. It wasn't happiness, not yet. That would take more time, more healing, more distance from the pain of the past few weeks. But it was something close to closure, something that felt like the end of a long and terrible chapter. A few days after the story broke, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address on the envelope, but the handwriting was instantly, achingly familiar. It was James's handwriting, the neat, precise letters I had seen on birthday cards and anniversary notes, and the little messages he used to leave on the kitchen counter when he had to leave for work early. The letter was postmarked 2 days before his death, and it was addressed to me, to Elena Callahan, to his wife. I opened it with hands that trembled, and I read his final words. My dearest Elena, my love, my heart, my home. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened. Then I am gone, and you are alone, and I have left you with a burden that no one should ever have to carry. I am so sorry. Sorry for the secrets. Sorry for the lies. Sorry for not trusting you with the truth when I had every opportunity to do so. You deserved so much better than a husband who hid things from you, who kept you in the dark, who let you believe our life was simple and untroubled when it was anything but. I told myself I was protecting you. I told myself that the less you knew, the safer you would be. I told myself that I would tell you everything someday, when the danger had passed, when I had figured out a way to make things right. But the danger never passed, and I never figured out a way to make things right, and now I am out of time. The letter continued, and my tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink, but not obscuring the words that were etched into my heart. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Elena. From the moment I first saw you, standing in the rain outside the library, your hair plastered to your forehead and a stack of books clutched to your chest, I knew that my life had changed forever. You were fierce and brilliant and beautiful, and you looked at the world with an intensity that took my breath away. I didn't deserve you. I never deserved you. But I loved you with every fiber of my being, and I will love you until the end of time and beyond. Please don't let my mistakes define your future. Please don't let my secrets and my failures and my tragic, unnecessary death become the whole story of your life. You have so much life left to live, so much joy left to experience, so much love left to give and to receive. Find happiness again. Find peace. find a way to move forward without forgetting the good things we had together. And know, always, that I am grateful for every moment we shared. Every laugh, every kiss, every quiet Sunday morning with coffee and the newspaper and your feet tucked under my thigh on the couch. Those moments were the best of my life, and I will carry them with me, wherever I am, for all of eternity. All my love, forever and always, James. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my heart, the tears flowing freely down my cheeks. He had known. He had known what was coming, and he had written me one last declaration of love, one final goodbye, in case he didn't survive. And now, because of a little girl with serious brown eyes and a dream she couldn't explain, I had been given the chance to fulfill his final wish. I had cleared his name. I had exposed the truth. I had brought Rebecca's killer to justice. I had kept my promise. I returned to the cemetery on a quiet morning in late autumn, when the leaves had turned golden and the air was crisp and cool. I stood before James's headstone, a simple granite marker with his name and dates, and a single line of inscription that I had chosen from one of his favorite poems. The grass had grown back over the grave, and the flowers from the funeral had long since been cleared away. It was peaceful here, quiet and still, a place of rest and reflection. I placed the letter on his grave, weighting it down with a small stone so the autumn wind wouldn't carry it away. "I love you too," I whispered. "I always have, and I always will. And I forgive you. For everything. For the secrets and the fear and the years of silence. I forgive you. You were a good man, James Callahan. A good man caught in a terrible situation. And I am so proud to have been your wife." I never saw the girl again. I asked around the town, described her to the people at the cemetery office, called the local schools, even placed a notice in the community newsletter asking for information. But no one recognized her. The woman at the cemetery gate said there was no record of a blue minivan entering or leaving on the afternoon of the funeral. The elementary schools had no students named Sophie who fit the description I provided. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air, delivered her message, and then vanished back into whatever mysterious realm she had come from. I chose to believe it was a miracle. I chose to believe that my husband, in his final moments, had found a way to reach across the boundary between the living and the dead and send me the truth. And I chose to believe that the girl, whoever she was, had been the messenger, an angel in the form of a child, sent for a single purpose and then released. Some people might call that irrational. Some people might call it wishful thinking. But I had stopped caring what other people thought. The evidence was real. The journal was real. The justice that had been served was real. And the love that had connected James and me, the love that had survived secrets and lies, and even death itself, that was the most real thing of all. I walked away from the cemetery that morning with my head held high and my heart full of a strange, bittersweet peace. My husband was gone, and he was never coming back. But he had given me a gift that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The gift of truth. The gift of justice. The gift of knowing that the man I had loved, the man I had married, the man I had mourned, was exactly who I had always believed him to be. A good man. A brave man. A man who had loved me with all his heart. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.